Hello, this is Colin with MakerFarm. This is the third video in the TronXY X1 build. This video we're going to start by doing the Z motor assembly. To do that, you're going to need to get your stepper motor that has the coupler on it. You'll get this Z motor seat. Then we're also going to get 4 M3 8mm long screws, 2 M4 12mm long screws, and then 2 M4 T-nuts. The first thing we're going to install is the Z motor seat onto that motor. You're going to use the M3 by 8mm long bolts to do that. Then you're going to make sure that the thickest part of that Z motor seat is at the opposite side of the motor as your motor connector is, the little white connector with the pins on it. Go ahead, tighten down those M3 bolts, and then we're going to install the Z motor on the back of the Z rail. After that's tightened down, grab the M4 bolts. They're going to slide into the bracket. Also put a T-nut on the other side, but don't tighten the T-nut all the way down, and install the other one as well. Then after that, we're going to align the T-nuts so that when we put it down against the extrusion, that we can put it inside of that extrusion to tighten it down. Also, you'll notice the motor is going to go right beneath the brass nut. That is where we're going to have the threaded rod that the motor will turn to raise and lower that whole X carriage assembly there. Go ahead, tighten the M4 bolts down. The T-nut should turn in the extrusion and lock it into place. Then you can grab your threaded rod and go ahead and thread that down through the brass nut. Then you're going to bring it all the way down into the coupler that is on the motor shaft, and at the end of that we're going to go and tighten the coupler down onto the threaded rod. Now if you turn that coupler by hand, you should see the whole X carriage assembly moving up and down. If not, make sure that the coupler is tight on the threaded rod and on the motor shaft as well. Next thing we're going to do is install this motor. This is going to be for our extruder, which is this little bag here. You'll notice off to the left of the brass nut, you're going to have an opening which will fit a motor. We're going to mount our extruder motor right there. To start, make sure the gear on your motor is tight. So go ahead and tighten down those set screws. We've got a couple pieces here. This is a metal block. On this metal piece, you're going to notice a little bump out that is in between my two fingers. That is going to go closest to the motor shaft when we install that. So go ahead and put your motor up next to the brass nut. That white connector is going to go towards the outside of the machine. Now you'll use 2 M3 22mm long bolts to secure the motor and that bracket to the assembly. Once you've tightened down those 2 bolts to secure the motor to that bracket, go ahead and grab the next metal piece from our extruder bag. It's going to already have some hardware installed on it, like this bearing and this bolt. Then go ahead and grab the M5 by 10mm long bolt, put it in there. There's also going to be a spring we're going to put on that bolt. And then there's going to be an M3 by 16mm long bolt that we're going to use to secure that to the third hole in the motor. So go ahead and line those properly and then tighten that down. Make sure that you don't tighten it too much to where this whole assembly won't move back and forth with the spring. Now grab this brass fitting that is going to go right to the left of your brass gear and that bearing. Go ahead and use a wrench to tighten that down and make sure that everything moves freely there. This brass fitting with the blue end, that is where our PTFE tube is going to go. Make sure you push it in all the way. It will stop, but you do want to make sure that it is seated. The next step we're going to do is the handle for the machine, which is right here. My handle came with 2 screws in the bag, which are not going to be used in the kit, you're going to want to get this acrylic piece. You'll also get two M5 by 10 millimeter long screws and two M4 by 12 millimeter long screws. To start, we're going to use the M5 by 10 millimeter long screws and put the acrylic piece on top of that extrusion, and the two M5 by 10 millimeter long screws will go through those two holes to secure it to the extrusion. Next, you'll get the handle, and you'll get the two M4 by 12 millimeter long screws, and that'll screw in from the opposite direction of the acrylic piece to secure the handle to the acrylic. Now we're going to mount the Z end stop. You'll need an end stop, you'll need one M4 by 8 millimeter long screw and one M4 T-nut. You're also going to need two M2 by 10. Then you'll need the Z end stop mount. You'll notice there's a recess in the acrylic piece for our M2 nuts. And then on the other side is where our switch will go. You'll notice how I have the flag closest to me. And then go ahead and install the M2 screw. Now get your M4 bolt, and that will go through the hole in the bottom of the acrylic piece that we just mounted our end stop to. And then on the back side of that, we're going to put our T-nut. Once again, don't tighten it down all the way. We're going to tighten it down when we install it on the printer. The Z end stop is going to go on the same extrusion that we just mounted our Z motor to. It's going to go on the opposite side of that extrusion. And what is going to happen is the acrylic piece that you can see there, when it comes down, it's going to hit that switch, and we want our nozzle to be just barely touching our bed when that happens. You can also adjust that height by moving that end stop up and down. Next, we're going to install our bed plate and our print surface. This is the bed plate, and then this clear piece that is kind of white is going to be our print surface. You're also going to need to get four M3 by 30 millimeter long screws. There's going to be four thumb nuts and four springs. We're going to install this black plate first onto the printer. You're going to use the four M3 screws. Also, the plate is recessed for the screw heads. Make sure you install them on the correct side. Otherwise, those screw heads are going to sit up above the plate. Once you get the four screws in there, you can turn your printer around, and it's going to go install down onto the Y rail that we put down earlier. You may have to turn your coupler to raise up your extruder a little bit to kind of get it out of the way. You'll notice the holes will align with the acrylic plate that we put down earlier. But before we put that down onto the acrylic plate, we are going to install the springs also on those M3 30 millimeter long screws. I like to install the springs one at a time. So put one spring on one of the bolts, get it aligned with the acrylic plate, and then compress it a little bit so you can put one of those thumb nuts on it. Once that one is installed, then you can go get another spring and install it on another bolt until you have all four of those installed. Now we can put this print surface on top of that black plate, and then we're going to use binder clips to secure it to the plate. Now we're going to put together the electronics enclosure. You're going to need your main board, these acrylic pieces that you see here in the video. We're also going to need 6 M3 by 20 millimeter long bolts. You're going to need 6 M3 nut and 4 plastic pillars. Go ahead and unwrap your main board, and then the top piece that has the two notches on the side, the two small notches, is what we're going to mount it to. If you look at your main board, one side has a USB connector that is going to go towards the back of the machine, and the back of the acrylic piece has no notches in it at all. So now you can go get 4 of those bolts, install those through the bottom of the acrylic, and then install a spacer on each of those 4 bolts. Then we will install the main board on top and use 4 of the M3 nuts to tighten everything down. Now we're going to install the 2 sides using the 2 remaining screws and bolts. The USB connector is going to be at the back of the machine, and your sides are going to be angled. The side that is completely flat, that's not angled, is going to go back by the USB connector. All you'll do is slide a nut into that T slot and then install the bolt through the hole in the bottom, and then tighten it down, and that'll pull those 2 acrylic pieces together. Don't over tighten these at all, that will crack the acrylic. Then repeat the process for the other side. Now we're going to install the front plate, which we're going to use 2 M3 by 20 millimeter long screws. We're also going to use 2 M3 nuts and this acrylic piece here. It'll be the exact same as the sides. You'll just put the M3 nut into the T-slot and then go ahead and install the screw through the hole and tighten it down, just not too much. If you haven't already done this, now's a good time to remove the paper backing from your LCD. Before we start wiring our electronics, we're going to get the back plate that has this hole in it, and we're going to get our power receptacle. Go ahead and unscrew that nut from there. Go ahead and remove it from the wires as well. And we're going to slip the wires through the back plate, which has that hole in it. Make sure you put it through the correct side as shown here in the video. Then you can go ahead and install the nut back on and tighten it down to keep the power connector in place. Now we're going to attach that power connector to your main board. I'm going to connect it to one of these green connectors, which I'm going to show you here in the video. First thing you're going to want to do is twist the wires at the very end to make sure that they go into the connector. And it is going to be this green connector right here. It is labeled a positive and a negative. And in this one right here, we're going to put the wires. Just unscrew it first. It's going to open up a little clamp. You can then push the wires into the side and then tighten that screw down, which will lock those wires in place. Next, we're going to attach the LCD. You're going to have a gray ribbon cable like this in your kit. One end is going to attach here to the LCD, and then the other end will attach to your main board right back by the USB port. After that, you're going to have some more wires for your motors. These are going to be labeled, which does make it easier. One end will connect to a motor, and then the other end will connect to your main board. They are different lengths, as different motors will require different lengths. The first one we're going to install is going to be the X motor cable. The next one will be the Y motor cable. There is a wiring diagram in your build guide for this, which is a really good thing to follow. The next one will be your Z motor. And the last motor cable is your extruder motor. This is the longest one. Mine was labeled Z2, but it is the extruder motor. Now we're going to get the extruder / hot end wires from our printer. We're going to start connecting those to our electronics as well. The hot end thermistor, which has the little white cable, is going to go all the way to the left side of your electronics. Next will be the hot end heater. If the insulation is already stripped, you can go ahead and cut that off and twist the wires together. If not, you may have to cut off that insulation. The hot end heater does not have polarity, so it doesn't matter which wire you put in the two connectors. Earlier when we installed the power connector, there was a red wire and a black wire. Those ones, it did matter which screw terminal you put those in. So for these, we're going to skip the green screw terminal in the middle, and we're going to go to the screw terminal on the left. The screw terminal that we installed the power connector to was the one on the right. Go ahead. Next we have the hot end fan. It does have a connector on it. We just installed the hot end heater. To the left of that is a connector we're going to leave open, and then the next connector is where we're going to plug in our hot end fan, or it's also called our cooler fan. So you are going to skip that connector in between the hot end heater and the hot end fan. After that, we've got 3 ports left that we're going to wire, and those the first end stop we're going to wire is our X end stop that plugs in right next to our cooler fan. After that, we're going to do the Y end stop, which is the one that the bed is going to go back and trigger. And then the very last one is our Z end stop, which is at the back of the machine opposite of the Z motor, and that will go into the next one. There is still going to be a space in between the Z end stop and the hot end thermistor. That is typically used for heat bed thermistor, which this kit doesn't use. After that, we can go ahead and we can align that back plate to install the back plate and the LCD onto the electronics mount. Now we're going to plug in the motor wires to the actual motors. The very first one we're going to start with is Z1. This is the Z motor that has the threaded rod connected to it that goes up through the brass nut. The next motor is the Y motor. This motor moves the build surface forwards and backwards. Next one is the X motor. This is going to move the hot end to the right and the left. Then the very last one is going to be the extruder motor, labeled Z2, and this is right next to the brass nut. Now you can go grab your power brick. That's going to plug into the back of the power connector. I would recommend going through and making sure you did plug everything in correctly before you plug in your power cord. Once you've verified all that, you can plug the power cord in. If everything worked out correctly, you're going to see your LCD power up as shown here in the video. Now I'm going to use the buttons on the LCD to do home all. This is going to move each axis to its end stop. We're going to do this because we need to adjust the height of our build plate. Using the thumb screws, we can turn those, and that's going to raise and lower our build plate. After we've homed it, our nozzle is going to go down and hit that Z end stop, and then we can adjust the build plate lower so that our nozzle can clear that build plate. The easiest way that I have found to do this is to manually move the bed and the nozzle to each corner, and then turn that thumb screw and move it to the next corner to turn the next thumb screw, and just do that whole process. You're going to go around the bed a couple times to make sure that everything is level, and you want it to be just a little bit above that bed so that when you put the print surface on there, the nozzle is just barely contacting the print surface. Now I'm going to plug the power back in, and I'm going to go back into the quick settings, do the home all again, see if everything moves correctly. If it's not, I can go and reposition items, or I can lower the print surface, or I can move binder clips, and then home again until everything looks correct. Now I'm ready to do a test print. To do that, put your little micro SD card in the back of the electronics. There's a little slot for it. And you can go into print file and pick one of the G codes on that SD card. As soon as you do that, you should see the temperature of your hot end to start heat. On the one that I selected, it showed my actual temperature as 21 degrees Celsius, and then it went to the target temperature of 200 degrees. You should then see your hot end temperature rising. Once it reaches that target temperature, it should start printing. I usually wait to do my wire management until after I've verified that everything is moving correctly. You'll also notice I didn't install any filament in the machine. I'll usually wait until I do this first test print as a dry run, and then on the next print, once I get the wire management done, I'll add filament.